Na vertigem dos acontecimentos imediatos, nós perdemos de vista e corremos o risco de nos tornar insensíveis até ao mundo que nos rodeia. Hoje, aqui no Jornal das 9, temos um documento único. A história da vida e da morte de Sergei Magnitsky. Era um advogado russo que morreu aos 37 anos e morreu a acreditar que a justiça na sua terra, depois do fim da longa ditadura marxista-leninista, era possível. Enganou-se e pagou por esse engano com a vida. William Browder, um empresário, foi o último empregador de Magnitsky e assumiu como sua missão pessoal denunciar pelo mundo fora a brutalidade da morte na prisão do seu advogado e do seu amigo. Já esteve aqui no Parlamento de Portugal, em Lisboa, levado por João Soares. E aqui no Jornal das 9, William Browder contou a sua extraordinária história.
Mr. Browder, what was the first sign that something was wrong with Sergei?
Well, Sergei when Sergei got arrested in November of 2008. And Sergei almost immediately started to write from prison various complaints about how he was being tortured. And then they put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds. They put him in cells with no heat.
Right from the beginning.
Right from the very beginning. And the reason that we know this is that he started to write down in the form of complaints about this, his mistreatment. And even though the Russians never responded to any of his complaints, he was able to file these complaints, and we got copies from his lawyer. And so as his torture and his maltreatment started to increase, we started to get a sense of it from these documents that he would send outside of the prison.
What were the legal grounds for his detention?
Well, there was what we call a trumped-up criminal case. Sergei testified against some corrupt police officers in the Russian Interior Ministry who were involved in a massive scam or crime against the Russian state that Sergei uncovered. He testified against those police officers.
This was during Medvedev's presidency, or,
yes,
or first Putin presidency?
No, this was in 2008.
Medvedev.
Medvedev was the president, and Sergei discovered this big crime. He discovered that police officers were involved. He testified against the police officers who were involved. And then the same police officers came to his house a month later and arrested him on a supposed tax crime that occurred in 2001. There was no reason for him to arrest him.
Was there a formal indictment or?
Oh, there's all sorts of formal indictments and formal statements, but there was never any crime. They just made it up. They made up a crime in order to arrest him because he blew the whistle on official corruption.
Could he have a defense? Did he have a formal defense?
Yes, he had. So they charged him with a crime of having been involved in a company that didn't pay taxes in 2001. I should point this out. This is 2008. They arrest him for a crime that supposedly took place in 2001.
7 years before.
And the most important thing is he had nothing to do with the company in 2001. And they didn't bother to check their facts. They just made up a crime in order to arrest him. And once they arrested him, they started to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony against the police officers.
What did you do, personally?
Well, so...
the man worked for you to start with.
Here's my lawyer. And I should take one step back. I hired 7 lawyers when the police started to harass and try to commit all of these crimes against us using our companies and so on. The police opened up criminal cases against all 7 of our lawyers from 4 different law firms. And my first instinct was to try to get everybody out of Russia. And so I asked every one of our lawyers, I said, guys, I'm sorry this has happened. You were my lawyers. This happened because you worked for me. Let's get you out of Russia at my expense. And 6 of the 7 lawyers accepted my invitation and came to London. The one guy...
Russians.
Some of them didn't even speak a word of English. But 6 of them accepted my invitation. But Sergei was the one guy who didn't. And the difference between Sergei and the other lawyers was that he was 10 years younger than them. All of these guys had been grown up during the Soviet times and knew that laws meant nothing, that if the government decides to go after you, nothing matters. And so they left. But Sergei said, I've not broken any laws. The only thing that's happened is that the police have broken laws, and I'm going to testify against them. And so Sergei stayed. He testified, and then...
Did he have a family?
Sergei had a wife, 2 kids, and a dependent mother.
How does your involvement in Russia come about? Why this fascination with becoming a capitalist, a Western capitalist in Russia?
Well, I have a very strange family background. I'm originally born in America. My grandfather, who was also an American, was a labor union organizer in the 1920s. And he was invited by the Communist Party to come to Russia in 1927. He goes to Russia.
Was he a contemporary of John Reed, actually?
He was a successor to John Reed.
Had John Reed died? I'm not familiar with the dates at the moment.
I don't know the overlap, but
they knew each other.
I don't believe they knew each other. I think John Reed was maybe 15 years before, during this maybe around 1917.
So those are pretty big shoes to get into.
Well, I think my grandfather had much bigger shoes when you hear the next part of the story. So in 1932, so he stays in Russia from 1927 to 1932. He meets a young Russian girl who becomes my grandmother. My father is born in Moscow. And then in 1932, the Communist Party sends him to America to become the General Secretary of the American Communist Party. He ran for president.
He was the first General Secretary.
No, he wasn't the first. He was the General Secretary.
But was he the first of an organized Communist Party?
No, they even had it before him. But he ran for president in 1936 and 1940 against Roosevelt as a communist candidate. And in fact, he was the first American presidential candidate to have a black running mate, a black vice president.
I'm sure that caused all sorts of family problems at the time, and personal problems for him.
Well,
to be a communist wasn't...
To be a communist is not an easy thing, and to be a communist in America is a very difficult thing. He was eventually expelled from the Communist Party for being too capitalist. And in the 1950s, the McCarthy era began. And he was then persecuted for being a communist. So, coming back to your question, how did I get involved in Russia? When I was a teenager, I was born in 1964, and when I was going through my teenage years, I had a big rebellion, as many teenagers do. And how do you rebel from a family of communists? Well, in my case, I put on a suit and tie and became a capitalist, and there was nothing I could do to upset my family more than that. I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And I said to myself, wouldn't it be perfectly poetically elegant if my grandfather was the largest communist in America? I'm going to go to Eastern Europe and try to become the largest capitalist. And that's what...
For our viewers' benefit, Earl Browder, your grandfather, was actually so important in international communism that he actually, from his name, derived a certain philosophy of communism in the West, the Browderism.
Browderism. And
I learned recently.
So they called it Browderism, but the most interesting part about this whole thing...
What was that? A more moderate version of a...
Well, he believed that
early communism?
He believed that communists and capitalists could coexist. And
can they?
Well, Stalin didn't think so. So Stalin was obviously in charge.
And do you think they can?
Do I think they can? Well, I think we see in the world now, Sweden is a socialist country and seems to do perfectly well, you know, with capitalism at the same time. France now. The answer is, I think that these terms, communism and capitalism,
mean less and less.
Mean less and less. These are just political terms.
Your grandfather thought there could be an arrangement.
Well, he was a communist.
Across the curtain, still.
Well, I think he believed in a more mild form of communism, maybe what they would call socialism.
There was a current of Euro-communism that also prevailed here in the 50s and 60s.
And I think we're going to see more of that in the 2012 and
so
2013.
all that heritage attracted you to the new Russia, to the Russia after the wall.
So after the wall came down, Russia decided to privatize their economy. And when they privatized their economy, they gave everything away for free to the people. 50% of all the assets of Russia went to 22 people. But little crumbs were falling off the table. And that allowed me an opportunity to set up a business to invest in Russia called the Hermitage Fund. And
why did you choose the Hermitage Fund, the name?
Well, the Hermitage was where they kept all the treasures in Russia. And I thought I was going to be investing in what I thought were going to be the treasures of Russia, so I should call it.
So you chose which treasures?
Well,
oil?
In the Hermitage Museum, they hold the most famous paintings.
Oh,
but
yes.
in the Hermitage Fund, we held shares of the oil and gas companies, the aluminum companies, the metals companies, which have turned out to be the real treasures of Russia.
And you had success with the fund?
We had spectacular economic success. The fund went up 35 times over 10 years. But the problem was that a lot of the companies we were investing in, the management of those companies were stealing huge amounts of money.
The oligarchs.
The oligarchs. And I was shocked by that, both from a business standpoint and from a moral standpoint. I thought, how can these guys just do this with impunity? And so we then decided to try to...
What dimensions are we talking about? 50%, 70%?
We're talking about billions and billions of dollars. The management of Gazprom in the late 1990s stole oil reserves equal to the size of Kuwait. This is the largest thefts in the history of the world, orchestrated just under everyone's noses in Russia in the late 1990s. And I got very upset by this whole thing. I found it shocking both from a business standpoint and from a moral standpoint. And so I decided to do something about it. And we decided to do investigations, private investigations, into how they were stealing the money. And then to take that information, once we got it, we got some very good information, and we then shared it with the international media, with the Financial Times, with the New York Times, with Business Week, with the Washington Post. And by putting all this information out there, it had a very dramatic effect between 1999 and 2003. Because at the time, Putin, who had just come to power, was fighting with the same guys. He was fighting with the oligarchs. They were stealing power from him. They were stealing money from us. And so every time we would publicize a scandal, he would step in to try to do something about it. Not because he was a good guy, but because there's an expression, your enemy's enemy is your friend. So this went perfectly. I had the most beautiful job you could ever have, where I could do good and make money at the same time. It's very rare that you can put those two things together. But it only lasted until 2003. In 2003, Putin arrested the richest man in Russia, a guy named Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos. He put him on trial, and they allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. And imagine, you're the 17th richest man in Russia, and you see a man much richer and smarter than you sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction?
You don't want to be there.
You don't want to be sitting in that cage. And so one by one, these guys went to Putin, and they said, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage? And Putin said, it's very simple. 50%. Not 50% for the government, not 50% for the presidential administration, 50% for Vladimir Putin. He became the richest man in the world.
Was there any such proposal made to the Hermitage Fund?
Never.
Through you?
Never.
Through your lawyers?
Never. Never. And why wouldn't they make such a proposal? Because I was one busy exposing their corruption. So, you know what happened was that I kept on exposing their corruption in 2004 and 2005, after they put this guy in jail and after they did their deal with the oligarchs. And in November of 2005, as I was flying back to Russia, I'd been living there 10 years, I was the largest foreign investor in their country with $4.5 billion invested in Russia. They stopped me at the border, they put me in the detention center of the airport, they held me there overnight, and then they expelled me from the country and declared me a threat to national security.
You're an American national, of course.
I'm a British citizen.
British citizen.
At this point, I sold all of my shares in Russia. I didn't want to have anything to do. I didn't want to have anything at risk in Russia. I took all of my people out of Russia. I brought them to London. I dusted off my hands and I said, "Whew, got out before.
That covered several lawyers, staff.
Just all my staff. I had no lawyers at this point. I thought I was done. I thought that was the end of a story. It would be an interesting book to write. I thought that was the end. It turns out it was the beginning of the worst nightmare that anyone could ever imagine. 18 months later, the police in Moscow raided my office, seized all of our documents, and then the next thing we knew, those documents were used to steal our investment holding companies. At this point, I hire Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer.
Was your first contact then with him? Mm-hmm.
No, we knew him before, but I used him to hire to figure out what they were up to.
He's sort of criminal lawyer, tax lawyer?
He's a tax lawyer, a company lawyer, a specialist, but the smart lawyer, the smartest lawyer I knew in Russia. And we hired 6 other lawyers in addition to that. But Sergei's job was to investigate what was really going on. And he came back and he said, this is a very ugly situation. He said, not only have the police stolen your companies, but they've also used the documents seized to forge $1 billion of fake backdated contracts to claim your companies owe $1 billion to 3 shell companies. And I said, oh my God, this is not good. He said, it gets worse. He said, the shell companies sued your companies in Russian court for $1 billion. And I said, what happened? He said, well, you didn't know that you were being sued because you didn't own your company.
So it was confiscated altogether, with the legal core on top.
With the legal machinations, they got a claim against our companies for $1 billion. They then the police go to our banks looking for $1 billion. But there's no money there because we took it away before. At this point, I dusted off my hands. I thought, okay, they didn't get it. Thank God. Phew. Mm-hmm. Sergei said, this is not how these Russian stories end. He said, there's more to the story. And I said, what's more? He said, I don't know, but I'm going to investigate. He comes back 4 months later, and he said, I figured it out. This is more cynical than anything I could have imagined. He said, when they didn't get your money, they then, through a very complicated scheme, stole $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government. So they didn't steal my money. They stole from their own government $230 million in the largest tax refund fraud in Russian history. Sergei figured it out. He testified against the police officers in October of 2008. And 1 month later, the same police officers who seized the documents, who Sergei testified against, came to his house at 8 in the morning in front of his wife and 2 children, arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, and then started to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day so they'd impose sleep deprivation. They put him in a cell with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, and so he nearly froze to death. They put him in a cell with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. After 6 months of this, he became very ill. He lost 20 kilos. He had very severe stomach pains, and he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones. And he was scheduled to have an operation on the 1st of August 2009. 1 week before the operation, they came to him and said, if you sign the following false confession saying you stole the $230 million, we'll let you go ahead and have the operation. He refused. And as a result of that, they abruptly moved him to a different prison called Butyrka, a maximum security prison, one of the toughest in Russia. And most importantly for Sergei, they had no medical facilities there whatsoever. At Butyrka, his health went into a downward spiral. He went into constant, agonizing, ear-piercing pain. They absolutely refused him any medical attention whatsoever. He applied in writing 20 different times for medical attention, for painkillers, for something.
Are there documents of that?
Sergei documented everything. He wrote down 450 complaints in his 358 days in detention. And because of that, we have an absolute perfect granular record of every single thing that happened to him, who did it, when, and how. On the night of November 16th, Sergei went into critical condition. At that point, they moved him to a different prison that had an emergency room. But when he arrived at the prison, they didn't put him in the emergency room. They put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him for 1 hour and 18 minutes until he died at the age of 37. He left a wife and 2 children and a dependent mother. This case is different than the thousands of other cases in Russia because we know every detail. There is no plausible deniability. We know exactly who killed Sergei Magnitsky. Down to the person, down to the signature, we have evidence. In spite of that, and in spite of the fact that this case is now the most well-known case in Russia, there are 27,000 newspaper articles that mention the name Sergei Magnitsky in the Russian press. Not a single person has been charged or prosecuted who were involved from the Interior Ministry or any of these organizations.
Did you lodge a formal complaint against the current authorities?
Hundreds of complaints. We've gone to court probably 100 times, and the entire system has shut down and circled the wagons to protect the people involved. The officers involved have been exonerated, they've been promoted, and some of them have been given the highest state honors for their involvement in killing Sergei Magnitsky. And so this is a crime not of religion, not of ideology. This was a crime of money. This was a crime to steal money. And we said to ourselves, if we can't get justice inside of Russia, the one thing we know is that these people like to spend their money outside of Russia. They like to buy houses in Europe. They like to keep their money in Swiss banks and American banks. Let's take that privilege away from them. And so for the last year and a half, I've been working with the US Congress, with the British Parliament, with the European Parliament, with various other parliaments. And today, I'm going to be going to the Portuguese Parliament to impose visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. We have a Magnitsky law going through the Congress in America. The British Parliament held a unanimous resolution calling for visa bans. The Dutch Parliament did the same thing.
Against the people found to be...
the people who were involved in the killing of Sergei Magnitsky. And we know we've hit a nerve because the Russians have absolutely gone out of their mind, the Russian government. Now, the Russian government is not interested in prosecuting the people who stole $230 million, but they're now making it a national priority to fight against these sanctions. And the reason that I know that is because 2 days after Putin was inaugurated as president, he came up with an executive order defining his foreign policy objectives. And his third most important U.S. foreign policy objective was to fight against the Magnitsky Act going through the U.S. Congress.
At the moment.
Yeah.
Well, it's a terrible story. Have things improved since Sergei's death at all?
No, no. Things have only gotten worse in Russia. And the reason that when you turn on the television and you see people, hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating against Putin is because people have had enough in Russia. The situation has deteriorated to the point where it really is a harsh criminal and authoritarian regime.
Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to meet you. Good luck.
Thanks.
On your campaign.